Thank you so much for coming out to have a chat about a really heavy topic on a Monday morning. I'm on a beautiful spring day, so it kind of feels like a bit of a downer. But anyway, so I'm going to talk to you about my PhD research, which just recently got published. But before I get into the findings and I guess implications and things like that, I wanted to start with one of the stories of the women that I spoke to as part of this research. So Alison, not her real name, I'll be using student names throughout. So Alison met her partner, as so many of us do, on a night out, having drinks and some dancing. And for about 2 years, they were on-off again. And the reason why they were on-off again was that she didn't have any concerns about him as a person, but he was in the armed forces. And so he had numerous deployments and postings, and she just didn't know whether she wanted that for herself. Was that part of her life plan? She decided it was, and they got married, and very quickly soon after she became pregnant with their first child. So until this point in time, Alison would have described her partner as loving, caring, gentle, sensitive, attentive to her needs. But when she became pregnant, he became an abusive partner. And for her, that looked like him walking into rooms and shouting at the top of his lungs to try and make her upset. He would emotionally abuse her, make derogatory comments. He was also very sexually aggressive towards her. So he would walk around behind her all day screaming, "Why aren't you having sex with me? You're having sex with someone, but you're not having sex with me, so you must be playing around on me." Once she had given birth and things had kind of settled down a little bit, he went back to what she would describe as normal. So there was no more abuse, no more emotional abuse, no more screaming at her or demanding sex. And then she felt safe enough to get pregnant again because she just attributed that to a blip in their relationship. But then again, he became very violent and abusive towards her. And at this point, when she was pregnant with her second child, she decided this was not the life that she wanted for herself. And so she decided to leave him. So she started making really strategic plans about what that would look like. And it started with her starting to reach out to domestic violence services and to the police, not to report him for abuse, but simply she was looking for advice about what her legal options were. If she wanted to leave him, could she take the children out of state with them? Would she legally have the right to do that? But she was also, during this time, keeping really detailed journals. So she was on a day-to-day basis writing down all the incidents of abuse that she was experiencing, as well as the advice that she was receiving from the different services that she was reaching out to. So one day, Alison's partner found these diaries. She had hidden them, but he found them. And he confronted her with them. And she was expecting that he was going to scream at her, rip them up in front of her, yell at her, all of those things that he had done so many times previously. But instead, he started to cry and he collapsed and basically said, "I don't want to be this person. I can see now what you've been saying. I don't want to be this person. I want to change." And she gave him an ultimatum: "You need to change or I'm leaving and I'm taking the boys." And she said that this started what was the best period of their relationship. So for 3 years, there was absolutely no emotional abuse. There was no violence. There was no derogatory comments. She said they went on fabulous family holidays. She started to really, trust him again and all of those kinds of things. And so she felt safe again to fall pregnant again. And then the abuse started again. And at this point, she decided to leave the relationship. So how do we understand and explain Alison's experiences of the complete cessation of violence and abuse for an extended period of time and then the resumption of that violence and abuse? I mean, we could, as Alison herself did, attribute this to anomaly. So she said, "I'm a real outlier. No one's had my kind of experiences. This is really a very anomalous kind of experience." However, we know from international research using longitudinal studies that actually Alison's experiences are not isolated, that desistance does occur within abusive relationships and is actually relatively common. It's only when we try to explain why desistance occurs that we start to stumble, because we don't really have appropriate frameworks to understand why someone may stop using violence and abuse. And this, I guess, kind of absence of understanding of why desistance occurs is really telling, considering that intimate partner violence is one of the most common, costly and harmful forms of violence in Australia and internationally. So it's obviously of direct policy interest. So how can we stop offenders from offending? But also we know that so many of the mainstream responses that we have to intimate partner violence, so things like arrests, detainment, protection orders, men's behaviour change programs, are not always going to be effective in all circumstances. And that was certainly Alison's experiences. Her partner was never the subject of a protection order. He was never incarcerated. He never participated in a men's behaviour change program. So why did he stop? So that's really the question that I wanted to answer, was to really understand the desistance of intimate partner violence within abusive relationships. So desistance theory has really evolved over the last 40 years, and it's not really been applied to intimate partner violence, and I'll come back to why that could be. But our understanding of what desistance is has changed significantly over time. So initially we thought of desistance as an event, a key demarcation between an offending trajectory and a non-offending trajectory. So what happened at that one point in time that led to someone stopping their offending behaviour? But now we understand that desistance is more of a process of maintenance, that it may be characterised by periods of relapse and remission, and that it also may actually involve a cognitive component as well. So it's not just about what someone is or is not doing, it's about how they think about themselves and think about the offending behaviour more generally. So over the last 40 years, there are some really common frameworks that we've used to understand how and under what circumstances desistance occurs. And that can be broadly categorised as the ontogenetic kind of models or maturation models. Basically, people get too old to engage in crime, or they may just develop more and decide that crime is not really what they want to be doing. You've got the sociogenic models, which is all about understanding the role of social processes and structures on people's behaviours, so things like employment, education, family responsibilities and the like. Then there's the agentic models, which really focus on the role of the offenders themselves in the desistance process, so understanding what they were thinking at different points in time and their decision to purposefully not offend. But although all these models have a different kind of emphasis in terms of what they think is most important, they really do kind of attend to all of them. So we talk about desistance theory as really being integrated models, so understanding the interplay between sociogenic, agentic, and this maturation kind of process in the desistance process. So it's all a very complicated web of different factors. So as I said, intimate partner violence has not really been explored through a desistance lens. And this is probably for a couple of reasons. The first one being probably ontological, conceptual, in that when we talk about intimate partner violence, we talk about a very common linear pattern of a behaviour, where once it starts, it does not stop. Instead, it escalates in severity and frequency over time. So it almost seems like a bit of an oxymoron to talk about intimate partner violence desistance. But as I've said, it does occur. We just don't understand why it occurs. But also, desistance theory has primarily been informed by the use of interviews with male property offenders, as well as longitudinal data sets that involve male property offenders. So this means that we don't really have an understanding of how it applies specifically to intimate partner violence. There might be some really important differences at play. And certainly because we only really talk to offenders about desistance processes, what we kind of understand in terms of the role of other people in that desistance process is pretty limited. So Shad Maruna is a really important desistance theorist, and he talks about offenders being really territorial about their desistance journeys and talking about how it was all them, no one else helped them. That person might have been really supportive, but really desistance was all about them. However, is that really likely to be the case? I mean, no one is an island. Even when you're talking about a male property offender, they've probably got family members in their lives who are helping them to stop offending. It could also be that they have parole workers, probation officers, etc., who are helping them to kind of go on this journey. And when we think about it in the intimate partner violence context, we have this really interesting dynamic where we have the victim survivor and the offender in an ongoing domestic relationship with one another on an ongoing basis. So I mean, certainly many of the women that I spoke to for this research had been in a relationship with their partner for decades. So this means that victim survivors of intimate partner violence are in a really unique position to talk to us about behaviour change processes and to ascribe reasons for why their partner may stop or not stop. But also it's probably likely that they are themselves doing things, implementing strategies, doing different kinds of actions and inactions as a way of trying to support the desistance process. And certainly when we look at the research that actually looks at the role of victim survivors, we pretty much look at them in the context of, did you fight back and what was the impact of that? But really, we know that there would likely be so many other strategies that victim survivors are using to try and bring about desistance. So what I really wanted to do was to dig into that, to really understand the role of victim survivors of intimate partner violence in the desistance of male-perpetrated abuse against them. So these are my research questions, but that's the general kind of aim. What is the role of victim survivors in intimate partner violence, desistance pathways? What are the impact of strategies, etc.? So what did I do? I did semi-structured interviews with 40 women who self-identified that they had experienced intimate partner violence perpetrated by a male partner during their lifetime. They had to live in Canberra and the surrounding regions so that I could do a face-to-face interview. So this was pre-COVID, so 2019, so I just squeaked in. I did community-based recruitment, so I didn't go through the criminal justice system. I didn't go through men's behaviour change programs. I put ads through Facebook and Twitter. I did radio interviews and I did print media kind of ads asking for people to express an interest. So I got about 80 women who self-identified and wanted to participate in about a 2-month period, and then I spoke to 40 at the end of the day. So the interviews were kind of focused on this life history narrative, so just asking them to explain their relationships to me, and then we kind of together interrogated their relationships and the patterns of violence and abuse that they were experiencing at different points in time. And this is just an example of the kind of ad that I put up on Facebook to try and recruit participants. Anyway, so because this is a desistance study, I had to define what I meant by desistance, and I was very much informed by the literature in terms of what I defined as desistance. So for the purpose of this study, desistance was defined as the violence and abuse had stopped or reduced significantly for 6 months or longer while the relationship was intact. By intact, I mean the victim survivor and the offender were still together. So I had 15 women who met this, criteria to be included in this group. And they also self-identified that they had experienced desistance. So that was our starting point, was that they themselves identified as experiencing desistance, and then we interrogated the data with them. And then that meant that I had 25 women who said that the violence and abuse had remained the same or escalated while the relationship was intact. So once it had stopped, it was ongoing and in many cases escalated in frequency and severity. Okay, so what did we find? So in the first instance, I looked at the 40 women as a group to look at the kinds of strategies that they were using to try and keep themselves safe, as well as to support the longer term behaviour change kind of processes. And the strategies that women were using could be broadly kind of grouped into 3 areas, and the first of which was the regulation of their own behaviours. So this was by far the most common strategy used by women, and it primarily looked like compliance and managing triggers. So compliance, or as someone else put it to me, submission, looked like basically complying with the rules of the relationship. So women's understanding of what the rules of the relationship were differed across the sample, ranging from a very small number of women who said that their partner was very explicit with them in terms of what the rules were. So one respondent said that her partner sat her down once they had gotten married and said, right, we're married, this is how you're going to clean the house, this is when dinner's going to be ready for me, this is what you're going to wear, you're not allowed to see this person again, etc., etc. Whereas for most women, compliance was a much trickier thing for them to negotiate because it was never explicitly stated to them. They learnt what the rules of the relationship were through trial and error. So, for example, several women said that he never told me I wasn't allowed to go out, but when I did go out with my friends, he would text bomb me during the evening. And then when I came home, he would be really sulky and withdrawn and emotionally distant with me for days. And so what I learned from that was that I wasn't actually allowed to go out. So that was a much more common kind of scenario. One of the other ways in which women were keeping themselves safe and trying to support longer term behaviour change was through managing triggers. So this was things like mitigating the impact of situational stresses. So things like the kids are crying, kids need care, doing the childcare runs, all of those kinds of things, managing things like financial stress, stress associated with studies. A lot of women actually spoke about how their partner would get really stressed and abusive when they were preparing for exams. And so they would completely drop their own study prep and support their partners so that they would be emotionally okay during that study prep period. The couple of, triggers that I found really interesting in particular was regulating their emotional affect and also minimizing their emotional needs. So women in these relationships often talked about how there was no space in the relationship for them to have an emotional need, because when they would demonstrate that they were struggling in some way, that they were stressed, that they were upset, their partner would blow up at them and scream at them about how you're being completely unreasonable and you just need to fix yourself and those kinds of things. So in many of those circumstances, the respondents would find other ways of satisfying their emotional needs. So things like reaching out to friends and family members, going to a counsellor, engaging in other kind of self-care practices. But regulating their emotional affect was really interesting to me, because it was even in cases of women would be really conscious not to appear too happy in front of their partners, because if they appeared too happy, then their partner would assume that they were sleeping around. And so they would just really consciously manage how they were looking on a day-to-day basis, because if they smiled too big, their partner would accuse them of having an affair. So we're just looking at a really broad range in terms of managing triggers, from those, every day, I'm going to look after the kids today so you can have some space, through to I'm not going to smile around you because if I smile, you think that I'm sleeping around, which is just really bananas. So I think one of the instincts that we have when we think about compliance and managing triggers is that we immediately go, well, these are women in survivor mode and they're just responding to risk as it presents to them. And so they're not really trying to support longer term behavior change. However, when you actually dig into the narratives of these women, when they're talking about the things that they would do to try and make their partners emotionally okay, you actually do see that there's some longer term planning going on, and they were using opportunities as they presented themselves to try and bring about longer term behavior change. And I think that's really nicely articulated through Harriet's story. So Harriet spoke about an instance where she was punched in the face by her partner and it caused one of her teeth to crack, die. And so she had to go to a dentist, and they were talking about doing root canal surgery. And her partner was incredibly emotionally distressed by this incident, that he was really emotionally distressed that he had caused this harm, but also that, she could potentially tell someone as part of her treatment what had happened, and so he would get into trouble. And so she said that even after they tried to fix my tooth and have root canal, and they said that the tooth would die and it would be black, even then I was trying to make my husband feel better, because I said, oh, who else is going to have me when I have a black tooth? Is that trying to keep myself safe? Was that in the background? My thought was, you keep telling me I'm having an affair, but yeah, who else is going to have me when I have a black tooth? So talking to Harriet about this was really interesting, because she kept on kind of going, I don't know why I said this at this time. Was this me trying to keep myself safe? And I've spoken to a number of other women who say that this quote really resonates with them, because they remember at different points in their relationship, they would use these kinds of incidents or examples as a way of trying to reassure their partner, I'm not going to leave you. The violence is about me leaving you, but guess what? I can't leave you because no one else would have me. So for example, I spoke to one woman after a presentation I gave who said that when she was pregnant, she would say, oh, look how fat and uncomfortable I am. No one else would have me, so you're stuck with me. And this became something that she would kind of repeatedly tell him at different points in her life. So I think that we have this instinct of it's just survivor mode, but I think this is actually very strategic, agentic kind of work being done by victim survivors. So another cohort of women said that at different points in the relationship, they would challenge their partner's behavior. So oftentimes this was not used because women said that they didn't feel safe challenging their partner's behavior, but there were different stages in the relationship where they felt that it was. So it could have been in the aftermath of a really serious incident when their partner was really contrite. They would try to talk to them about how this behavior is unacceptable and I need you to stop. But even then, it was very rare that women said that women would actually call the abuse what it was, which was abuse. Instead, they would use other language as a way of trying to get their partner to address the underlying causes of the behavior without saying it's abuse. So for example, a number of women talked about how they would say to their partner, you just don't seem very happy in this relationship with me. I feel like you're really struggling at the moment. Maybe we should go talk to someone so that we can talk about how we can make you happier, even though really what they were saying is you're being violent and I need you to stop. But they wouldn't talk about it in those terms, which I found really interesting. One of the ones that I found really, really interesting was that instead of directly addressing the behaviour and saying, you're doing this or you're unhappy and we need to get some help, is that they would establish boundaries or withhold relational goods. So relational goods is something that we talk about in desistance theory, where it's basically a consequence associated with offending, that if you engage in offending, you may lose relational goods, which could be relationships with an intimate partner, a family member, your parents, things like that. So we talk about how the loss of relational goods can actually trigger desistance processes. And there are a number of women in the sample who would, in different ways, withhold relational goods as a way of trying to get their partners to change their behaviours. Oftentimes this looked like them saying, I'm not going to, like refusing marriage proposals, refusing to get engaged, refusing to make major purchases together, refusing to get loans together, refusing to have kids, things like that. And I mean, in some of those circumstances, it was because, frankly, the respondents hated their partners and didn't want to actually be with them anymore. They just didn't know how to leave safely. But in many other circumstances, it was because they were trying to withhold something that their partner wanted as a way of encouraging them to change their behaviours. And again, I think this is really nicely articulated by Jess when she said, in my heart of hearts, what I was hoping was going to happen is that if I remained steadfast in my own values, that they would come to the realization of, okay, she's not backing down, she's not backing off, I'm not getting anywhere with her, as in she won't accept a marriage proposal, she won't go into a mortgage with me so that we can start our lives in that fashion. So I was hoping all of these things, and I was just hoping that they were going to get to the point of, okay, if I want these things enough, it looks like I'm going to have to bend somewhat to make this happen. The final strategy was third-party help seeking. So this really seemed to be at the end of the relationship when women were starting to look at ways of leaving the relationship safely. They would start reaching out to family members and friends, as well as to formal support services like the police, domestic violence services, and child protection services. However, as I articulated with Alison's story, in some circumstances, it wasn't just about how can I leave safely, it was about creating a paper trail so that if they did decide to leave later on, that they would have some documented evidence to support things like custody applications and things like that. Whereas for other women, it was actually just trying to bring in a third-party voice into the relationship to reinforce or, I guess, support what they had been saying to their partner, which is these behaviours are not appropriate, you're not allowed to do these things, etc. So, for example, one woman that I spoke to said that she engaged in relationship counselling because she wanted her partner to understand and believe that he wasn't allowed to sexually assault her even though she was married to him, because he had it in his head that he was allowed to rape her because she was married to him. And simply going to a relationship counsellor and having this relationship counsellor say to him, she's right, you're legally not allowed to do this, was enough for them to get a really significant de-escalation in the violence because he learnt what was legally allowed within the relationship. I find the relationship counselling stuff really, really interesting. So for a number of women, relationship counselling was a really safe space within which they could get third-party help seeking and voices involved in the relationship without incurring the issues of legal intervention and things like that. So, for example, Grace was talking about how she didn't want to go to the police. She didn't think she would ever really want to go to the police, and that relationship counselling kind of was still a nice mechanism for her to get support without inviting that kind of intervention into their lives. And 15 of the 40 women said that they had gone to relationship counselling at some point in time. Some found it really, really helpful. Others found it really, really unhelpful, particularly when it wasn't trauma-informed and the relationship counsellor wasn't aware that there was intimate partner violence at play. But I think that this is really just an interesting example of the ways in which women were seeking help without going to what we would see as kind of those typical sources, so things like domestic violence services and the criminal justice system. So what were the impact of these strategies? So for regulating their own behaviours, it was the most effective but also the most deleterious for women, and I'm going to come back to that. Managing their partner's behaviours pretty frequently resulted in increase in violence and abuse and denial and minimisation. So, for example, when women would try to withdraw relational goods and put up emotional boundaries around themselves and withdraw things like sexual intimacy, that actually in many occasions escalated the violence because these men saw it as, she's going to leave me, I need to use violence as a means of bringing her back, which is very consistent with what we know about attachment theory and things like that. And really, really sadly, third-party help seeking was pretty unhelpful in many circumstances. So many women who were talking to their friends and family members were met with denial and minimisation and victim blaming. When they spoke to the police, it often resulted in criminalisation. So women were told that they could be prosecuted because they had acted in self-defence or pushed against their partner. And in some circumstances, when they reached out to child protection services, they then were investigated to see whether or not they were protective factors in their children's lives. So third-party help seeking, unless it was for the purpose of trying to leave the relationship, was uniformly not felt as being very effective. Okay, so let's talk about our subsample of 15 women who said that they had experienced desistance. And I think I'll just come back to this again to say that when I did the advertising for this project, I asked that women self-identify that they had experienced desistance. And I provided the definition of desistance, which was the complete end of all violence and abuse or a significant de-escalation of the abuse. And all of the women in this sample said, yes, that's me. I experienced the complete cessation of abuse or a significant de-escalation in the abuse. And they could identify the period of time for which that had occurred, and they could also articulate what was happening at different stages of the relationship, which they could see as contributing factors to the desistance. However, when you actually look at the nature of the abuse that these women were experiencing, complete cessation of abuse was really, really rare. So it only actually occurred for 3 women in the entire sample that all forms of violence and abuse had stopped completely, whereas what was more common is that physical violence had stopped for most women, but other forms of violence and abuse had continued or escalated in severity. So this is a very confusing table. But what I wanted to just demonstrate is that across the 4 main kind of types of violence and abuse that women were experiencing, it was more often that physical violence stopped and the other forms of abuse kind of continued or escalated in severity. And Bella's case is really interesting. So Bella had experienced really significant physical violence from her partner as well as emotional abuse. But at one point in time, she reported him to university services, and so they became involved and got him into mandatory counselling and things like that, and the physical violence stopped. However, he then said to her, "You got me in trouble, so now you owe me sex." And so from that point on, there was no physical violence in the relationship, but he was very sexually aggressive towards her. Despite that, she said, "I experienced desistance." So this is a really tricky kind of space where we really need to unpack a little bit more in terms of, did these women actually experience desistance? But I will come back to that. But what we have to take from this is that there was an overall net reduction in abuse for many of the women in the sample, and there was complete cessation for some as well. And what are the mechanisms that the women themselves attributed to this, as well as what we kind of gleaned through the narratives? So the ones I'm going to be focusing on are increasing consequences and capable guardianship, the men's desire for control and dominance have been satisfied, and the evocation of feared selves. So what we know from desistance theory is that if you increase the consequences associated with offending behaviours, whatever those consequences may be, then it is less likely that people will engage in those behaviours. So the consequences that were described by respondents that we identified through the narratives were typically the end of the relationship. So women would either verbally or non-verbally communicate to their partners that they were about to leave the relationship or thinking seriously about leaving the relationship. There were also overt and covert threats to report to the police or actual reporting to the police, as well as the physical sanctions from a capable guardian. So there were other kind of consequences, but these were the kind of the core main 3. And so what do we mean by physical sanctions from a capable guardian? So many of the women in the sample had children, and they noted that when their children got older, particularly their male children got older, when their children hit about 12 or 13 years old, that they noted a significant de-escalation in the physical abuse that was being perpetrated against them. And they directly attributed this to their partner becoming concerned that they would in turn be physically assaulted by their children if they were harmful towards them. So as Mary said, he could see my son was getting stronger. He was growing into a man, and my husband would see him, and this worried him because he knew that my son was growing stronger, that this control over me he didn't have that control as much. And so Mary's experiences, she remembered an incident where her son, who was about 12 or 13, was twirling sticks in the backyard. Her husband actually turned to her and said, I need to take a pop at him because he's going to start thinking he's going to get too big for his boots, effectively. And she said, you're not allowed to touch him. I would call Child Protection Services. And potentially the threat in concert with that kind of concern that her son would actually be able to physically harm him seemed to reduce the physical violence and stop it for a period of about 7 years before she ended the relationship. So men's desire for dominance and control was satisfied. So this was a really interesting one. So for many of the men, the driving, I guess, motivation for their use of violence and abuse was control. It was about trying to dominate their partner in various realms of their lives. And several of the women said that when they were fully compliant with the rules within the relationship, when they were doing what their partner wanted them to do, that the violence and abuse stopped or de-escalated considerably. And this is likely because their partner's need for control and dominance had been satisfied for that cohort of offenders. However, there were some men who also seemed to stop being abusive when they were able to, I guess, perform well in other areas of their lives. So we know that, there's a lot of research to suggest that in many circumstances, men's use of control and dominance against their partners may be attributable in part because of feelings of a lack of control in other domains of their lives, particularly their careers, or because of their internalized distress about not living up to their own internalized ideals of masculinity and manhood. And certainly several of the women said that when he was doing well in his career, he was great. Like he seemed to just kind of get what he needed in terms of those feelings of dominance and control and power in his career. And so he would come home and he would be perfectly fine with me. But when things started to go pear-shaped in their careers, which many times it did because these were those kinds of men who are narcissistic and don't deal very well with being told what to do, they would come home and start perpetrating abuse against their partners. So there were several women who said that for multiple years their partner was great because everything was going well in their career, but when things started going pear-shaped in their career, that the violence and abuse kind of resumed again. Okay, and the final mechanism I want to talk about is the evocation of feared selves. So in desistance literature, in the agentic kind of framework, there's a lot of discussions about the role of feared selves in promoting desistance. So this feared self is triggered by a frustration event, so something like maybe being arrested, losing a relationship, things like that. But whatever the mechanism is, it supposedly triggers this kind of forward thinking from the offender's point of view where they go, that's me in the future. If I continue to offend, I don't want to be that. So I'm going to, purposefully try to do something different. I'm going to engage in non-offending. I'm going to leave this area where I know I'm vulnerable to offending, and things like that. And certainly what we see is that there were certainly many women who said that they were trying to evoke a feared self. They didn't use the language of feared selves, but they would say things like, when he was being violent and abusive, I would say to him, you're acting like your dad, or you're acting like your stepdad, or your uncle, because many of these men had histories of family violence in their families of origin. And they would talk about how much they hated these male figures in their lives who had been abusive towards them. And so their partners were trying to trigger for them this realization of you are behaving like that person that you hate as a way of trying to get them to stop their abusive behavior. And certainly there were also a number of instances where there was a particularly violent episode of abuse that was a significant point of escalation within the relationship. And their partners said that after this, there was a significant period of de-escalation or complete cessation of abuse. And they said that there were a couple of times when they could see their partner was really shocked by what they had done and really distressed by what they had done. And potentially the way that we could explain that is that maybe for them they had evoked a feared self, where they had gone, oh my God, I have become someone that I don't like, or I have become someone like my dad, etc. And there are a couple of instances where, for example, after an escalation event, their partners would be inconsolable, distressed, emotionally very distressed. And in a couple of circumstances, their partners tried to self-harm after these episodes of escalation. So there was obviously a really strong emotional response after these events. And certainly Alison's experiences, so who I spoke about at the beginning, seems to be quite consistent with this. So this is Alison recalling the incident where her partner discovered the journals that she had been keeping that documented all of the forms of abuse. And instead of becoming incredibly angry when he discovered the journals, instead he collapsed and said, I don't want to be this person. So could we explain what happened in Alison's case, that her partner evoked a feared self, where he looked into the future and saw where he was going and he didn't want that. And so he committed to a period of desistance for 3 years. Okay, so this brings me to the question of, did respondents actually experience desistance? So in the first case, so why would we think that this is consistent with desistance? So the definition of desistance that I used is consistent with the literature, and respondents self-identified that there had been a significant break in the patterns of abuse that they had been experiencing up to that point in time. This was noteworthy because of the length of the non-abuse period, as well as their ability to understand and identify key factors that preceded that period of de-escalation or cessation. So they themselves saw this as desistance. And even if it was just a de-escalation, they experienced it as meaningful. So they were able to say, it was a lot better. He wasn't physically violent towards me. He was still emotionally abusive towards me, but it was much better. So would we still classify that as desistance? Desistance theory would say yes, that this is desistance in the spirit of desistance, and we should treat it as such. However, I have some issues with that. So is it desistance if it is not intentional? So there is ongoing debate within desistance theory, and I'm sorry, I will talk a little bit about desistance theory wonk, but then I will bring it back to this in hopefully a very compelling way. So there is ongoing debate in desistance theory about whether or not you actually need to have an offender who is consciously trying to desist in order for desistance to happen. However, there are the sociogenic researchers who would say, look, people can actually just change without really intending to because of their change in circumstances. So it could be that they leave an area where they used to hang out with a bunch of people who they offended with, but then they left for whatever reason, and so they didn't have contact with those people and they didn't have those opportunities anymore, and so they stopped offending. So is that desistance? If they were not consciously going, I'm going to stop offending, and so that is desistance. On the other end of it, you've got the agentic kind of side of the thing saying it has to be intentional in order to be meaningful. However, then there's a whole thing of like, well, but people can say that they're going straight, but they don't necessarily do it. So how many intimate partner violence abusers say, I will never do this again, and then continue to do it? So there's this really kind of tricky thing of like, does it have to be intentional? But I think what this study really demonstrates is that in almost all of the cases, the men did not seem to be motivated to change their behaviours. They were very much, and in terms of how we would know that, they said these things, but they would continue to do these behaviours. They weren't engaging in counselling. They were really resistant to participating in relationship counselling. They weren't self-referring into a men's behaviour change program. They weren't doing all of those things that you would expect to see if someone was motivated to stop offending. So I think that this is a really kind of, just put a pin in this and we'll come back to it. Because is it desistance if it is dependent on the labour of victim survivors? So if we think about this as through a sociogenic lens, we could kind of see that victim survivors are a social structure or force who are promoting desistance of abuse perpetrated against them. And certainly that is consistent with desistance. However, when we actually look at the work that women are doing to try and bring about desistance, these strategies are in and of themselves experienced as abusive. So women say, look, I'm mitigating triggers, but it means that I can't see my friends. I have to wear what he wants me to wear. I can't have an emotional reality within our relationship because it's all about him. The violence may have stopped, but the strategies that it took to get there are in themselves abusive. So is that desistance? So there's this whole kind of conversation about, is it desistance in the spirit of desistance? So we may see the behaviour change, But in the absence of a cognitive shift where they've actually tried to commit to changing their behaviours, and if women are still doing all of the emotional labour in terms of actually promoting desistance, is it desistance? And I think this is really nicely articulated by Elaine here when she said, I just thought, right, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not doing anything at all. I'm doing everything exactly the way he tells me. Everything is going to be fine. Like, it'll all be fine. I just kept telling myself that. And the violence actually stopped for a long time. It was about 12 months. Because I was just his little minion. I did everything I was meant to. I didn't talk to anyone. I did every single thing he told me to do. I think if I had said the wrong thing or not done what he'd asked, it would have just continued. But the fact is, I just knuckled down. So Elaine self-identified that she had experienced desistance because all of the forms of violence and abuse had stopped within the relationship for 12 months, but it was all because she basically sublimated everything about herself to make her partner happy. So she's a good example of how the men's desire for dominance and control had been satisfied, and so he was no longer abusive. But at what cost? Would we say that this is desistance in the spirit of desistance? And then finally, I think the other question that we need to ask ourselves is, are we actually comfortable with defining desistance as it relates to intimate partner violence as a significant reduction in abuse? So desistance as a process of maintenance is something that we talk about within desistance theory. We are very comfortable talking about periods of relapse and remission when we talk about desistance more generally. But that may be an artifact of the reality of using desistance theory primarily to explain male property offenders' desistance processes. Are we comfortable with kind of going, well, hey, it's only 5 times a year as opposed to 10. Are we still comfortable with defining that as desistance? If we take a broader lens, yes. But should we be calling this something different when we're talking about it in terms of intimate partner violence? Because one incident of abuse can be incredibly harmful. It can be an intimate partner homicide. Like, it only takes one to have a really significant impact on an individual. So Elaine, she experienced 12 months of desistance of abuse, but the first incident that happened when it started up again was that he choked her to the point of unconsciousness in front of her 2 kids, which is that was just one incident. Would we still call that desistance? So at the end of the day, it's complicated, which is not particularly helpful. So this is basically like a little bit of a framework for going, okay, so desistance, when all forms of violence and abuse have stopped entirely, it should be kind of where we're at. But really, when we're talking about desistance and intimate partner violence, we're probably talking more about intermittence. So it stops for extended periods of time, but then it resumes again. We might be talking about a net de-escalation and abuse where some forms of violence and abuse stop, but others start or are kind of ongoing. And then right down the bottom, it's desistance due to the labour of victim survivors, which is there's behaviour change, but he hasn't changed. And the strategies that women are using are in and of themselves experienced as a form of abuse. So very quickly, what are the implications for policy and practice? So in the first instance, regardless of whether they should be involved, victim survivors had an active role in men's desistance and were highly motivated to support their partners. The median length of time that women were in these relationships was 10 years. And for that entire period of time, they were pretty much the only people in their partners' lives who were trying to support them to stop. However, at the moment, the current framework we have when we're trying to engage with victim survivors is because we're so concerned about responsibilising them, we don't engage them in conversations about their partner's behaviour when we're going through things like men's behaviour change. It does differ across programs, but typically there's a real reluctance to involve women in those conversations. But the reality is they're already doing it. They've been doing it for longer than we have, and they have a better understanding of the violence and the abuse. Service systems are not set up to support women to be in relationships that they want safely. So as I said, third-party help seeking was really negatively experienced by women while they were still in the relationships. And this was not just, and they weren't just staying in these relationships for structural reasons, it was also for emotional reasons. And our service systems are just not built to kind of address that. And relationship counselling was viewed by respondents as a viable and safe option for seeking support when they're still motivated to remain in their relationship. So again, it's a thing of regardless of whether or not we think women should be reaching out to relationship support services, they are. And for their own reasons, they see it as a really safe and viable option for getting some third-party help seeking. And for desistance theory and research, intimate partner violence desistance involves multiple trajectories at any point in time. Can we be satisfied with contemporary definitions of desistance, de-escalation, relapse and remission in the context of intimate partner violence? And desistance, when it was dependent on strategies used by victim survivors, is not consistent with the spirit of desistance. Which is kind of a bit of a bummer. I don't think that this means that basically desistance doesn't help. I think that it actually just means that we have to be really careful about what we mean by desistance when we talk about it in the context of intimate partner violence. And we have to do some real soul searching around what level of remission are we going to be comfortable with? How do we ask these questions of women when we're asking them about whether the violence has stopped? Because it could be as simple as, yeah, the violence has stopped. Okay, so what's happening? Like, what does that look like for you? Does that mean that the emotional abuse has stopped completely, or is it still ongoing, but he's just not physically violent? We need to stop talking about it in a global sense and really actually kind of go, what does desistance mean to these women when we ask them, are you safer? And I'll leave that. Thanks, guys.